I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
The unscheduled guest. It was a Tuesday, and I was doing my best to remain inconspicuous behind my desk, which is a fairly tall order in an office as heavily populated with heavy furniture as the one in Nero Wolfe's Brownstone on West 35th Street. Wolfe was in his oversized, specially reinforced chair, his eyes closed, his breathing as steady and rhythmic as a grandfather clock, and a book on the cultivation of rare orchids resting face down on his mountainous lap. Everything was exactly as it should be, which meant the air was thick with the scent of beer, pipe tobacco, and the impending sense of boredom that usually preceded an afternoon of filing or, God forbid, more cataloging of the basement plant collections. Then the doorbell rang. Fritz took his time getting to it, but the sound of the front door opening and closing was followed immediately by the rustle of expensive silk and the sharp rhythmic tap of heels on the parquet floor that signaled someone who was not only agitated but used to getting their way. I didn't even look up from my typewriter, focusing instead on the memo I was drafting for the insurance agency, but I felt Wolfe's eyes snap open. He didn't move, but the atmosphere in the room shifted, tightening like a string pulled to its breaking point. The woman who swept into the office was somewhere in her 30s, dressed in a tailored navy suit that cost more than my annual salary, and carrying a handbag that looked like it could be used as a blunt instrument if the need arose. Her eyes were bright with a frantic cold light, and she didn't wait for an invitation to take the chair opposite Wolfe. She looked at him as if he were a piece of scenery that needed moving, then shifted her gaze to me, her lips thinning into a line of strained impatience. She didn't offer a name, but she tossed a heavy, embossed envelope onto Wolfe's desk, the seal glinting with a wax insignia I didn't recognize. Wolfe merely looked at the envelope as if it were a particularly unsightly insect that had landed on his desk by mistake. He didn't touch it. He let out a long, weary sigh that seemed to deflate his chest by at least an inch, and then he looked at the woman with that peculiar combination of disdain and absolute neutrality he reserved for people who thought money could purchase the laws of nature. The woman spoke then, her voice a sharp, clipped soprano that sounded like glass breaking on marble. She told us that her name was Evelyn Saint Clare, and that the sanctity of Blackstone Manor, her family's estate upstate, had been compromised by a series of events that the local authorities were either too incompetent or too corrupt to address. She didn't want the police, and she certainly didn't want the headlines. What she wanted, she said, was for Wolfe to facilitate a quiet, absolute resolution to a matter involving the systematic dismantling of her father's legacy. She spoke of missing ledgers, altered documents, and a climate of fear among the household staff that had turned her childhood home into a prison. She wasn't asking for help. She was issuing a demand for a return to the status quo. Wolfe continued to sit as still as a statue, his yellow eyes tracking the movement of a dust mote in the sliver of sunlight piercing the heavy curtains. He didn't seem to hear the urgency in her voice, but I knew that look. It was the look he wore when he was calculating the price of his own discomfort. When she finished, the room was silent enough that I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen down the hall. Wolfe finally leaned forward, his hands folded neatly over his enormous stomach, and told her that he was not an investigator for domestic grievances. He informed her, with that infuriatingly deliberate cadence of his, that his services were reserved for matters of significant consequence, and that the internal squabbles of a private estate were of no interest to him. He practically reached for the buzzer to signal Fritz to escort her out. But then she did something I didn't expect. She didn't plead. She didn't offer a bigger check. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out a small, tarnished silver key, and placed it on the desk next to the envelope. She told him that if he refused, the information contained in the vault at Blackstone would be destroyed by midnight, and with it, the only evidence that linked a very prominent, very dangerous man in the city to the sudden disappearance of a certain orchid collector in the Amazon 3 years ago. Wolfe went absolutely still. The silence this time was heavy, oppressive, and smelled of ozone. I watched his fingers twitch once against the fabric of his coat, a small, involuntary motion that was the only thing betraying his inner agitation. He didn't look at the key, but his entire demeanor had changed. The apathy was gone, replaced by a razor-sharp focus that made the office feel suddenly cramped, as if the walls were closing in to watch what he would do next. He looked at the woman, his face a mask of iron, and told her that she had made a grave mistake in thinking she could use his interests as a lure. He then told her to wait in the parlor, and that he would inform her of his decision after he had consulted with his assistant. She stood up, her expression triumphantly smug, and left the room without a backward glance. When the door clicked shut, Wolfe turned to me, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He told me to fetch my coat and to go to the kitchen to tell Fritz that dinner would be delayed. Then he told me to get in touch with Sol Panzer and to be ready to leave for the country by nightfall. The sanctity of his home had been invaded, and he was going to see it through, though he hadn't yet told me why, to a permanent shadow. The drive to Blackstone Manor was the kind of long, winding journey that gave a man plenty of time to contemplate his life choices, most of which in my case involved wondering why I hadn't taken up something simpler, like professional gambling or maybe deep-sea salvage. The country air, when we finally reached the estate, was crisp and biting at the skin, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was a stark contrast to the thick, controlled climate of the Brownstone. The house itself was a sprawling, stone-faced monstrosity that seemed to be actively trying to blend into the surrounding fog. As I stopped the car, I felt the familiar itch between my shoulder blades. We weren't just here to solve a family dispute. We were here because Wolfe had been baited by a ghost from his own past, and he didn't like being reminded that he had loose ends waiting in the dark corners of the world. We were met at the front door by a man who looked like he had been poured into a tuxedo and left to dry. He introduced himself as Henderson, the estate manager, a man whose smile didn't reach his eyes and whose posture suggested he was holding his breath. He led us into a drawing room that was large enough to house a small army, yet it felt suffocatingly small. Evelyn Saint. Claire was waiting, looking just as composed and cold as she had in the office, but now she was accompanied by a man standing by the hearth, nursing a drink and looking at us with the kind of lazy, calculated interest usually reserved for a prize horse at auction. This was Arthur Saint. Claire, the brother, a man whose hands were steady but whose eyes betrayed a twitchy, nervous energy. The room was deathly quiet, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the low, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed to be counting down to something we weren't privy to yet. Wolfe didn't bother with pleasantries. He took the most substantial chair in the room, tested it for stability, and then settled in, looking for all the world like a man who had come to inspect the upholstery. I stood by the doorway, my hands in my pockets, taking in the room. It was a textbook study in staged domesticity. Every piece of furniture, every painting on the wall, and every shadow in the corner felt intentional. Evelyn began to explain the situation in more detail, her voice projecting a confidence that didn't match the frantic blinking of her eyes. She described a series of petty thefts, a missing ledger, a misplaced key, a letter that had vanished from her private desk, that had escalated into a pattern of psychological warfare. She claimed that someone within the household was trying to systematically dismantle the family's holdings to force a sale of the estate, a prospect that clearly horrified both her and her brother. Arthur, for his part, contributed a cynical laugh and a comment about how boring the whole thing was, though he took a long, hard swallow of his drink before he said it. He seemed to think the whole investigation was a waste of time, a fancy way of indulging his sister's paranoia. Wolfe watched them both, his eyes half closed, saying nothing. It was his signature move, the silence designed to make people uncomfortable enough to fill the void with their own secrets. I kept my gaze moving. I noticed the way Henderson hovered in the doorway, his eyes darting toward the desk in the corner every time Evelyn mentioned the missing documents. I noticed the faint smudge of ink on Arthur's cuff, a detail he didn't seem aware of. And I noticed the way the room seemed to shrink even further, the walls closing in on the small, brittle group of people who all looked like they were hiding something behind their teeth. After a few minutes of listening to their strained explanations, Wolfe finally spoke. His voice was a calm, resonant boom that filled the room and made the glass in the cabinet rattle. He told them that he wasn't interested in their domestic squabbles or their petty power struggles, but he was very interested in the keys and documents they were so desperate to keep hidden. He requested that the entire household staff be gathered in the library within the hour, and that every ledger pertaining to the estate's holdings be produced for his inspection. Evelyn looked at Arthur, a flash of something that looked like fear crossing her face, but she nodded, agreeing to the demand. It was a bold move, and it effectively put them on notice. The game was no longer on their terms, it was on his. As we walked down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the library, the floorboards creaking under our weight, I caught up to Wolfe and asked him if he had any idea what we were actually looking for. He didn't turn his head, his gaze fixed on the heavy mahogany door ahead of us. He told me that we were looking for the intersection of desperation and greed, the point where a person's need to protect their own interests outweighed their sense of self-preservation. He reminded me that people, regardless of their station or their wealth, were incredibly predictable when they thought they were being watched. He told me to keep my eyes open for anything that looked like it didn't belong, specifically anything that hinted at a connection to the Amazon incident. He was keeping his cards close to his chest, as usual, but the way his jaw was set told me that this was far more than a simple matter of a missing ledger. The library was an imposing space, lined with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in a decade. We waited for the staff to arrive, the silence returning to reclaim the house. I could hear the wind howling outside, a mournful sound that made the warmth of the fire feel like a lie. I realized then that the disruption we were bringing to this house wasn't just about finding a thief. It was about tearing down the carefully constructed facade that these people had spent their lives maintaining. Wolfe sat in a chair, his eyes closed once more, his breathing deep and slow, looking as immovable as a mountain. I leaned against the bookshelves, feeling the weight of the mystery pressing against me, knowing that by the time we left this place, whatever secrets were buried within these walls would be laid bare, and the peace, fragile as it was, would be shattered beyond repair. 3. The Quintet of Discontent. The library, a cavernous room smelling of dry paper and cold ash, was filling up. 5 individuals stood in a ragged semicircle before Wolfe's chosen chair. There was Henderson, the estate manager, who looked as if he were trying to fade into the mahogany paneling. Beside him stood the cook, Mrs. Halloway, a woman whose face was a map of deep-set lines and whose hands were perpetually busy kneading the fabric of her apron. Near the window, keeping well away from the others, was the young gardener, Thomas, a boy who couldn't have been more than 20, with dirt under his nails and a look of profound discomfort in his eyes. Completing the group were the 2 housemaids, Clara and Beatrice, who were huddled together like 2 birds braced for a storm. They were a pathetic, nervous collection of humanity, and as I watched them, I couldn't help but think that Wolfe's presence alone was enough to make them feel like their very souls were being audited. Wolfe didn't say a word for a minute. He just sat there, his hands laced over his stomach, his eyes sweeping across the group with the deliberate intensity of a hawk circling its prey. He wasn't looking for a confession. He was looking for the tremor in a hand, the shift in a stance, the way a person's breathing patterns changed when they realized they were being weighed and measured. It was a silent interrogation, and it was devastatingly effective. Mrs. Halloway was the first to crack, shifting her weight and letting out a sharp, jagged sigh that sounded like a sob cut short. Henderson, conversely, stood straighter, his jaw set in a line of defensive pride. Wolfe finally leaned forward, his voice a low, smooth rumble that seemed to vibrate against the floorboards. He asked them, in his most pedantic and infuriatingly polite tone, if they realized that the atmosphere of Blackstone Manor had become one of suspicion and deceit. He didn't wait for an answer. He began to dissect their roles, not as employees, but as the pieces of a puzzle he was already well on his way to solving. He addressed Mrs. Halloway first, asking her about the deliveries to the kitchen and why a house of this size had been ordering an excess of exotic chemical reagents that weren't used in any of the recipes she claimed to prepare. She stammered something about a personal hobby, her face flushing a deep mottled red. Wolfe cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand, his expression one of bored indifference. He then turned to the gardener, Thomas, and questioned him about the late-night activity near the perimeter of the estate. The boy turned pale, his eyes darting toward Henderson for support, which he didn't get. It was clear that the hierarchy of this household was built on a foundation of mutual resentment and half-kept secrets, and Wolfe was picking it apart with the casual ease of a man shelling peas. I leaned against a bookshelf, keeping my eyes on the periphery. My job wasn't to grill them, it was to watch for the reaction that didn't fit. I saw Clara, the youngest maid, glance repeatedly toward the heavy roll-top desk in the corner. Her behavior was erratic, her gaze jumping from Wolfe to the desk and back again, as if she were waiting for the furniture to stand up and shout a confession. Beatrice was trying to appear calm, but her right hand was clenched so tightly in her apron that her knuckles were white. These people weren't just afraid of losing their jobs, they were terrified of what would happen if the truth about their domestic arrangement was laid out in the light of day. They were all complicit in a game they didn't fully understand, and Wolfe was forcing them to play by his rules. Wolfe's interrogation continued for another half hour. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't threaten them. He simply wove a net of questions, each one tighter than the last, until the space between them and the truth felt like it was vanishing. He pressed Henderson on the accounting discrepancies, trapping him in a series of contradictions regarding the estate's operational budget. He caught the cook in a lie about her whereabouts the night of the second theft. He cornered the gardener until the boy finally confessed to being paid to look the other way when certain visitors arrived after midnight. It was a masterclass in psychological deconstruction. By the time Wolfe signaled that the session was over, the air in the library was thick with tension, and the staff members looked like they had been through a physical brawl. When the staff had been dismissed, the room felt empty and cold. I walked over to the desk they had been staring at. It was locked, of course, but as I ran my fingers along the wood, I felt a slight indentation that didn't look like part of the grain. It was a hidden latch, perfectly camouflaged. I looked at Wolfe, who was still in his chair, his eyes closed, his expression one of deep, brooding concentration. I didn't need to ask him if he had noticed it. He had known it was there all along. He had brought these people in here not to get information from them, but to see who would guard that desk the most fiercely. I realized then that the mystery of Blackstone Manor wasn't about missing money or family secrets. It was about the power dynamic that governed this house, and the lengths people would go to preserve it. Wolfe had successfully identified the center of the infection, and now he was going to wait for the fever to break. 4 streets and subterfuge. The house had settled into a sullen, watchful silence by the time I stepped out into the night air. The fog had thickened, curling around the stone pillars of the veranda like a living thing, and for a moment I stood there just listening to the distant rhythmic drip of water from the eaves. It was exactly the kind of atmosphere that made a man feel like he was being watched, even if there wasn't a soul for a mile. My instructions from Wolfe had been simple. Leave the Brownstone politics behind, hit the pavement, and start digging into the lives of the people who inhabited Blackstone Manor. He wanted to know where the money was going, who was visiting in the dead of night, and most importantly, why a group of seemingly ordinary employees were acting like they were guarding the crown jewels. I drove into the nearest town, a place called Oakhaven, that looked like it had been designed specifically to be ignored by the rest of the world. The streets were narrow, poorly lit, and smelled of wood smoke and damp pine. I started at the local tavern, a place that served as the nerve center for anyone who wanted to know what was happening behind the closed doors of the big estates in the valley. It took about 3 beers and a handful of carefully placed questions to get the bartender, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a look of mild amusement, to start talking. I didn't ask about the St. Clairs directly. I asked about the turnover rate at Blackstone, and why the local suppliers had started getting suspicious about the kitchen orders, which involved crates far too heavy and specialized for simple catering. The picture that emerged was not one of a dying estate, but of a house that was being systematically hollowed out. The bartender mentioned that Henderson, the estate manager, had been seen meeting with a lawyer from the city on 3 separate occasions in the last month. He also mentioned that the gardener, Thomas, had been spotted at the train station at odd hours, carrying bags that looked far too heavy for a simple trip to visit his aunt. It was clear that someone was planning an exit, and that the thefts were just a cover for a larger operation. I left the tavern with a notebook full of names and times, feeling the familiar hum of a case beginning to take shape. I wasn't just chasing a thief anymore. I was chasing a conspiracy that was rooted in the very soil of the estate. I spent the next several hours in my car, parked near the edge of the Blackstone property, watching the main gate. The rain had started to fall in earnest, turning the gravel drive into a slick, treacherous path. It was miserable work, the kind of tedium that tests a man's patience, but it was also where the real detective work happened. Around 2 in the morning, A black sedan with its headlights off crawled down the road and turned toward the service entrance. It moved with a practiced, stealthy grace, the driver clearly familiar with the terrain. I didn't move. I just watched, my eyes strained, my heart steady. The car stopped near the secondary entrance, and a figure stepped out, wrapped in a long, dark coat. Even in the gloom, I recognized the gait. It was Arthur St. Clair. He wasn't alone for long. A figure emerged from the shadows of the trees to meet him, Henderson. They spoke for a few minutes, their voices swallowed by the sound of the rain. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the body language told the story. They weren't partners in crime, they were conspirators, their movements frantic and strained. Arthur handed Henderson a heavy leather-bound folder, the same kind of ledger I had seen on the desk in the library, and then turned to leave. I waited for the car to pull away before I started my engine. I needed to see where Henderson was going, and more importantly, what he was going to do with that ledger. I followed at a safe distance, the taillights of his car glowing like red embers in the mist. He did not return home. Instead, he drove to a small, abandoned barn on the far side of the property line, a place that looked like it hadn't seen a farmer in 20 years. He parked, got out, and walked inside. I waited a beat, then slipped out of my car and moved toward the barn, keeping to the shadows. I could hear the faint murmur of voices inside, joined by a third person I hadn't seen before. My blood ran cold. The third voice was sharp, cultured, and carried the unmistakable cadence of an outsider, someone who didn't belong in this rural backwater. I pressed myself against the side of the barn, trying to catch a stray word, a name, anything that would link this to the Amazon incident Wolfe had mentioned. Then I heard it, the mention of a shipment, of a crate left in a warehouse in the city, and a date that matched the disappearance of the orchid collector. It was the missing piece. The theft at Blackstone wasn't just about money. It was a desperate attempt to cover up a trail that led straight back to a crime Wolfe had been trying to solve for years. I realized then that we had walked right into a trap, or at least a situation that was much more dangerous than a family feud. I pulled my coat tighter, the dampness seeping into my bones, and started the long, quiet walk back to the car. I had enough to take back to Wolfe, but I also knew that the moment we stepped back into that house, the game would shift from observation to confrontation. The quiet, orderly world of the Brownstone was a world away, and the shadows here were starting to look a lot like teeth. 5. The paper trails fracture. I returned to the Brownstone an hour before dawn, my clothes damp and smelling of the damp, decaying atmosphere of the countryside. The house was silent, as it always was at that hour. Yet as I stepped into the hallway, I felt the unmistakable weight of someone waiting. I didn't head to my room to change. I went straight to the office. Wolfe was still in his chair, though he had discarded the book and was now staring at a small porcelain bowl of water he had placed on his desk. He didn't look at me when I entered, but his voice, clear and precise, cut through the quiet, asking for a full accounting of my night. I gave it to him, detail by detail, leaving out nothing. I told him about the meeting between Arthur and Henderson, the folder, and the voice of the stranger in the barn, a man who sounded like a ghost from an old case file. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, his fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against the armrest of his chair. When I mentioned the warehouse and the specific date associated with the Amazon incident, his tapping stopped. He opened his eyes, and the look he gave me was one of cold, calculating fury. He didn't erupt, he didn't pace, he simply became heavier, more immovable, a mountain of intellect forming a plan. He told me that my observation in the barn had provided the final piece of the crime's structural integrity. The theft of the ledger wasn't just to hide greed, it was an act of architectural removal. They were tearing down the house to hide the foundation, and that foundation was built on the remains of a life they had extinguished years ago. He told me to go to the kitchen, find Fritz and have him prepare a very specific set of infusions, not for drinking but for chemical analysis. The next few hours were a blur of activity that defied the slow, sedentary pace usually associated with the Brownstone, while Wolfe remained in his chair, seemingly doing nothing but thinking. I was back on the phone with Saul Panzer, giving him specific instructions on how to track the warehouse location in the city. The household at Blackstone was being monitored, and the net was tightening, but the most important work was happening right here in the office. Wolfe had requested a sample of the spices Mrs. Halloway had been ordering, the ones I had noticed in my earlier report. When Fritz brought them in, Wolfe didn't look at them. He gestured for me to open the containers. He wanted to know, down to the exact gram, how much of each ingredient had been used, and how much was missing. It turned out that the spices weren't spices at all. They were chemical precursors, the kind used in extracting and preserving organic samples. Wolfe's theory was brilliant in its simplicity. The thief wasn't just stealing money, they were using the kitchen to process evidence that was meant to be shipped overseas. The thefts of ledgers and documents were merely the background noise to hide the larger, more lucrative smuggling operation. The suspects weren't just petty criminals, they were conduits for a larger global trade that had been thriving under the cover of the St. Clair estate's reputation. Wolfe looked at the jars with a mix of academic interest and profound distaste. He explained to me that the human capacity for rationalizing corruption was the most predictable element of any investigation. I spent the rest of the morning cross-referencing the shipping manifests I had pulled from the local harbor records against the dates Arthur St. Clair had been seen at the estate. The correlation was exact. Every time a shipment of spices arrived at Blackstone, an export cargo left the harbor, destined for a warehouse that was tied to the very same man Wolfe had been tracking for 3 years. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. We hadn't just walked into a domestic dispute. We had stumbled upon the operation that had cost a man his life in the Amazon. Wolfe sat there, his face a mask of iron, contemplating the implications. He knew that the moment he moved to expose this, the entire house of cards would collapse, and there was a high probability that more than just secrets would be buried in the aftermath. He finally stood up, a rare, monumental event, and walked to the globe in the corner of the room. He spun it once, his finger resting on a spot that seemed insignificant to anyone else, but which I knew marked the beginning of his own long-standing vendetta. He told me that by the end of the day, we would return to Blackstone, not as guests, not as investigators, but as the architects of the final accounting. He wanted everything ready, evidence, witnesses, and leverage. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with the sharp, cold light of intellectual justice, and told me that the time for observation was over. The game was now about precision, and he was the only man alive who could ensure that the final move would be the one that checked them all. I left the office, the weight of the coming confrontation settling in my chest, knowing that the piece of the Brownstone was about to be burned away, and there would be no turning back. 6. The Panzer intervention. The drive back to the estate felt different this time, the car cutting through the oppressive afternoon heat like a blade through heavy silk. Beside me, Saul Panzer sat in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the horizon with the quiet, predatory focus of a man who could blend into a brick wall if the situation demanded it. He was the linchpin in Wolfe's design, the man who handled the messy, tactile reality that existed outside the rarefied air of the Brownstone. We were heading back to deliver an ultimatum, not a request for information. Wolfe had been clear. The element of surprise was a depreciating asset, and if we didn't solidify our control over the household before the next shipment arrived at the warehouse, we would be chasing shadows for the rest of our lives. As we turned onto the long gravel drive of Blackstone Manor, I noticed the change immediately. The estate, which had been a picture of somber, aristocratic restraint only hours before, now radiated a frantic, nervous energy. A delivery van was backed up to the service entrance, and I saw Henderson directing the transfer of crates that didn't look like kitchen supplies. I signaled for Saul to pull the car around to the rear, out of sight of the main house. We didn't need to announce our arrival. We needed to observe the final stage of the transfer. Saul slid out of the car, his movements fluid and silent, and vanished into the dense line of trees bordering the orchard. I stayed with the car, keeping a watchful eye on the service entrance, my hand resting near the door handle in case the situation turned volatile. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the only sound the hum of an idling engine and the distant, rhythmic thud of crates being loaded. I was waiting for the signal, a specific sequence of lights from the barn that would confirm Saul had compromised the shipment's integrity. When it finally came, a sharp, white flash in the darkness of the trees, I felt a surge of adrenaline. It was the moment Wolfe had anticipated. I didn't wait. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the service entrance, my pace steady and deliberate. Henderson looked up, his face losing all color the moment he saw me. He tried to block the doorway, his hands trembling, but I didn't stop. I walked past him, my expression one of cold, professional detachment, and moved into the kitchen. The room was a chaos of open crates and scattered supplies. Mrs. Halloway was there, clutching a handful of shipping labels as if they were a life raft. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and resignation. I didn't say a word. I just started looking through the crates, pulling out the materials that Wolfe had suspected were hidden in plain sight. It was all there, the precursors, the ledger pages, the correspondence addressed to the man in the city. The entire operation was laid out on the butcher block table, a testament to the sheer, blinding arrogance of a group that thought they could operate under the radar of a man like Nero Wolfe. I took a deep breath, letting the gravity of the situation settle, and checked my watch. Saul emerged from the shadows a moment later, holding a small, leather-bound notebook he had retrieved from the back of the delivery van. He handed it to me without a word, his expression unreadable. It was the master ledger, the record of every transaction, every payoff, and every shipment that had left the estate in the last 3 years. It was the key to the entire mystery, the document that linked the St. Clair family to the Amazon incident and the man who had ordered the hit on the orchid collector. I looked at the kitchen staff, who were now standing in the center of the room, looking like cornered animals. The game wasn't just over. The board had been flipped, and they were staring at the inevitable end of their tenure at Blackstone. I didn't need to interrogate them. They were already broken, the weight of their own complicity crushing the resolve they had been clinging to since our arrival. I told them to remain in the kitchen and not leave until I returned with Wolfe. I didn't have to threaten them. The authority in my voice, backed by the undeniable reality of what we had found, was enough. I walked back out to the car, the cool evening air feeling like a relief after the suffocating tension of the kitchen. Saul followed, his pace as measured as ever. We drove back to the front of the house, where Wolfe was waiting on the veranda. He hadn't moved an inch, but his eyes were bright, focused on the horizon, as if he were watching a storm gather. I stepped out of the car and walked toward him, the master ledger held firmly in my hand. I didn't have to say anything. Wolfe looked at the book, then back at me, a faint, satisfied smile touching his lips. He stood up, his massive frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the veranda, and told me that it was time to move to the final phase. The office gathering was set for the evening, and he wanted everyone, Evelyn, Arthur, and the staff, present for the autopsy of their deceit. He walked into the house, his stride heavy and purposeful, and I followed, knowing that the last case at Blackstone Manor was about to reach its logical, and for some, its inevitable conclusion. The sanctity of the Brownstone had been threatened, and Wolfe was about to reclaim it with a precision that would leave nothing standing in his path. 7. The Trap of Civility. The library had been transformed from a place of musty silence into a pressure cooker. Wolfe had taken command of the room with a subtle, overwhelming gravity that made the very air feel dense. He sat at the head of the long, oak-carved table, his massive hands folded over his stomach, his eyes half closed, as if he were drifting off to sleep. It was, of course, a calculated facade. I stood in the corner, my back against the bookshelves, keeping a watchful eye on the room's occupants. Evelyn and Arthur St. Clair sat across from one another, their faces pale, their movements stiff. The household staff were huddled on the far side of the room, their eyes darting nervously toward the heavy door every time it creaked. The silence was absolute, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock that sounded, in this atmosphere, like a series of hammer blows. Wolfe began without an introduction. He didn't clear his throat or offer a pleasantry. He simply started to speak, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. He didn't speak of the thefts or the petty grievances that had brought us to the estate. Instead, he spoke of the nature of shadows and the inevitable light that comes to displace them. He began to narrate the history of the Blackstone operation, starting with the Amazon incident 3 years ago. He spoke of the orchid collector, whose disappearance had never been solved, and he wove the names of companies, shipping manifests, and chemical precursors into a tapestry that left no room for doubt. He wasn't accusing them of a crime. He was explaining the mechanics of their ruin, his voice as calm and steady as the ticking clock. I watched them as he spoke. Evelyn's expression had shifted from cold arrogance to a kind of hollow, distant shock. Arthur, on the other hand, was sweating, his fingers fumbling with the hem of his jacket as he tried to avoid Wolfe's gaze. Wolfe didn't look at them, but he spoke as if he were dissecting them in real time, pulling apart the layers of their deception with a surgical precision that made me feel almost sorry for them. He reached the point where he detailed the meeting in the barn, the precise moment when the last of their efforts to hide their trail had been documented. He didn't mention my name or Saul's, but his description of the surveillance was so vivid that it felt like he had been there, a silent observer in the rafters, watching the entire sordid affair unfold. The atmosphere in the room tightened until it felt as if the walls were physically pressing in on us. Wolfe stopped speaking, allowing the silence to stretch, to grow, to become an entity of its own. He waited for someone to break, for the first sign of a crack in their collective defense. It was a classic, brutal move, the silent gambit that forced the truth to the surface by sheer force of expectation. Henderson, the estate manager, was the first to buckle. He stood up, his face ashen, and began to stammer a defense that sounded like the frantic chirping of a trapped bird. He claimed it was all Arthur's idea, that he had been coerced, that he was merely a functionary in a larger, darker game. Arthur lunged at him, a desperate, clumsy move that was stopped by a sharp, commanding word from Wolfe that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Wolfe silenced the ensuing chaos with nothing more than a look. He shifted his focus to Arthur, his gaze so heavy and so profoundly judgmental that the man slumped back into his chair, his spirit seemingly extinguished. Wolfe then proceeded to outline the evidence we had secured, the ledger from the barn, the analysis of the chemicals, and the correspondence linking them to the warehouse in the city. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight of his words was absolute. He spoke of justice, not as a legal concept, but as a moral imperative that had to be satisfied if the world was to remain in balance. He told them that they had not only violated the sanctity of their home, but had participated in the erasure of a life. And for that, there could be no quiet resolution. The air in the room seemed to clear, the toxic tension replaced by the cold, bracing reality of exposure. Evelyn, who had remained silent throughout the eruption, finally stood up. She looked at Wolfe, her face stripped of all the artifice and the cold, sharp armor she had worn since our arrival. She asked him what he wanted, her voice hollow and devoid of its earlier, clipped authority. Wolfe didn't blink. He told her that he wanted nothing from them but the truth, and the immediate, absolute cessation of the entire operation. He stipulated that all documentation, all remaining assets, and all contact with the urban conspirators were to be surrendered to the authorities by morning. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a surrender document drafted in the language of intellectual inevitability. I watched the final pieces of their control crumble. They were broken, not by the law, but by the overwhelming, quiet dominance of a man who had refused to let their secrets remain buried. As I looked around the room, I knew that the mystery was effectively solved, the puzzle pieces forced into their final fatal configuration. The library, once a refuge for the family's secrets, had become their confessional. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was the quiet of a house that had been purged of its infection, the dark, damp corners finally exposed to the cold, antiseptic air of truth. Wolfe sat there, his work nearly complete, the master of the house in every sense of the word, awaiting the final, inevitable collapse of the world they had tried so hard to build. 8. The office inquest. The transition from the library to the formal office in the Brownstone had been handled with a speed that left the St. Clair family in a state of shell-shocked disorientation. Wolfe had insisted that the final resolution take place on his own territory, the only place where he could guarantee the total surrender of his adversaries. When the clock struck 8 in the evening, the office was once again a temple of order. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, the yellow light from the desk lamp casting long, sharp shadows against the shelves of books, and the air was thick with the faint, comforting scent of pipe tobacco. Wolfe was back in his chair, the undisputed monarch of the room, while Evelyn and Arthur sat in the 2 uncomfortable wooden chairs I had placed for them. They looked small, fragile, and utterly out of place against the backdrop of Wolfe's monumental presence. I stood by the door, my hands in my pockets, acting as the silent warden. Saul Panzer was outside, ensuring that no further outside interference arrived to complicate the final stages of the process. The atmosphere in the room was not one of rage, but of cold, clinical finality. Wolfe began by placing the leather-bound ledger we had recovered from the barn directly in the center of his desk. He didn't open it. He simply let it sit there, a silent, damning indictment of the entire operation. He addressed Evelyn first, his voice as smooth and steady as the flow of a river, laying out the precise timeline of their involvement. He detailed not just the thefts and the smuggling, but the deliberate, calculated way they had leveraged their status to protect the very criminals who had orchestrated the Amazon disappearance. Evelyn tried to interrupt, her voice rising in a desperate pitch, but Wolfe silenced her with a single raised hand. He told her that her perspective was irrelevant, that the facts had already been established, and that there was no longer any room for narrative or justification. He spoke of the orchid collector with a rare, personal intensity, his eyes fixed on some point in the distance, his voice betraying the depth of the grudge he had been nurturing for 3 years. It wasn't just a professional interest for him, it was a matter of intellectual vindication. He had been haunted by the missing man, and now he was finally drawing the circle closed. Arthur, sitting beside his sister, looked as if he were trying to shrink into his own clothes, his eyes darting toward the door, as if he were contemplating a flight that he knew was impossible. Wolfe then turned his attention to the moral failure of the St. Clair family, treating them to a lecture that was both scathing and precise. He didn't call them evil, he called them small. He stripped away the veneer of their wealth and their social standing, revealing the petty greed and the profound cowardice that had driven them to participate in a criminal enterprise. He told them that their legacy, which they had fought so hard to protect, was already dead, and that the ruins of Blackstone Manor would serve as the only monument to their ambition. It was a brutal, systematic dismantling of their self-worth, and I watched as the last of their defiance flickered and died. They were no longer the masterminds of a smuggling ring. They were two frightened individuals standing before a man who held the key to their total erasure. The climax of the confrontation came when Wolfe reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a stack of documents I had spent the last 2 days gathering. They were the final pieces of the puzzle. The records of the warehouse ownership, the bank statements linked to the offshore accounts, and the signed statements from the shipping firms that had been compromised by the estate's involvement. He slid the stack across the desk, stopping just short of Evelyn's trembling hands. He told her that these were the keys to their absolution, provided they surrendered everything, including the location of the remaining evidence in the Amazon warehouse. He wasn't giving them a choice. He was giving them the path of least resistance toward their own survival. They were silent for a long time, the weight of the decision hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Evelyn reached out, her hand shaking, and pulled the documents toward her. She didn't look at Wolfe. She didn't look at the ledger. She simply stared at the papers as if they were a death warrant, which, in a way, they were. Arthur finally spoke, his voice cracked and weak, asking what would happen if they refused. Wolfe didn't bother to answer. He simply looked toward the door, where the sound of an approaching siren could be heard in the distance, a subtle, prearranged signal that Saul had triggered to remind them that the law was no longer a theoretical threat. The message was received. Evelyn stood up, her face a mask of hollow resignation. She told Wolfe that they would provide whatever he requested, the files would be turned over, and that they would never return to Blackstone Manor. They were, for all intents and purposes, dead to their own history. Wolfe nodded once, a brief, sharp motion, and signaled for me to escort them out. As I opened the door to the hallway, the cool night air brushed against my face, a stark contrast to the heavy, claustrophobic heat of the office. They walked out of the room without a backward glance, the heavy silence of the Brownstone closing in behind them, signaling the end of the conclave. The case was solved. The ledger was in our possession, and the weight that had been pressing on the house for days had finally, mercifully, begun to lift. 9. The anatomy of stagnation. The office was empty, but it felt more crowded than it had all evening. The scent of Evelyn's perfume still lingered in the air, a sharp floral cloy that clashed with the earthy, grounded smell of Wolfe's pipe tobacco. I walked to the window and pulled the heavy drapes back, letting the street lamp light spill across the floorboards. Outside, the city was moving on, oblivious to the fact that a small, quiet, and profoundly dirty war had just been concluded in this room. Wolfe remained in his chair, but the tension that had held him upright for hours had finally dissipated. He looked, for the first time, his true age, a mountain of a man who had earned his rest through the exertion of pure, concentrated thought. He didn't look at me. He looked at the ledger, which now sat open on his desk, revealing the names and figures that had cost a man his life in the Amazon. He began to talk, not to me, but to the room, to the ghosts of the investigation. He walked me through the anatomy of betrayal, piece by piece. The St. Clairs had never been the architects, they had been the conduits. They were people who believed that their name and their estate were shields that could repel the consequences of their actions. Wolfe spoke of the irony of their downfall, how they had allowed the very people they deemed beneath them to become the agents of their destruction. He explained that Henderson, the estate manager, had been the one to initiate the contact with the city conspirators, sensing early on that the family's finances were stagnant and that the estate could be used as a front for the illicit movement of sensitive materials. The reveal wasn't about the mechanics of the smuggling, however. It was about the psychology of the crime. Wolfe described how Evelyn and Arthur had slowly rationalized their complicity, convincing themselves that they were doing something for the greater good of the estate's future. It was the oldest, most pathetic story in the book, the corruption of ambition. He pointed to a specific entry in the ledger, a date from 3 years ago, that coincided with the disappearance of the orchid collector. It was the moment they had crossed the line, the moment they had chosen silence over morality. The collector hadn't been a victim of chance. He had been an obstacle to their enterprise, and they had stood by while he was disposed of to ensure their operation could proceed. As he spoke, the full weight of the investigation hit me. We hadn't just saved an estate, we had unearthed a grave. The collector, a man Wolfe had known and respected in the insular world of botany, had been sacrificed on the altar of St. Clair's greed. Wolfe's voice, which had remained calm throughout the night, tightened with a barely perceptible tremor of rage. He told me that the injustice was not in the crime itself, but in the arrogance of the people who believed they could bury it. He had spent years waiting for a crack in their facade, and when they finally came to him for help, driven by their own internal paranoia and the fear of their partners, he had seen the opportunity to bring the entire rotten structure down. He leaned back, his eyes closing, and allowed himself a moment of silence. I realized then that the reveal was for him as much as it was for the truth. He had needed to externalize the frustration, to transform the abstract suffering of the victim into a concrete reality that could be judged and punished. He told me that he would be forwarding the entirety of the evidence to the district attorney within the hour, ensuring that the St. Clairs would not just lose their estate, but would face the full measure of legal accountability. It was a cold, efficient justice, the kind that Wolfe excelled at delivering. He didn't want their apologies. He wanted their total removal from the sphere of polite society. The office felt cold again, the adrenaline of the confrontation fading into the quiet, steady rhythm of the house. I watched him sit there, his hands still folded, his mind already moving on to the next problem, or perhaps to the next orchid he would need to attend to in the basement. The reveal had been complete, the mystery deconstructed and solved, and the sanctity of the Brownstone had been restored. He opened his eyes and looked at me, a brief, sharp glance that conveyed everything that didn't need to be said. The case was finished, the betrayal had been addressed, and now the long, difficult process of returning to the normal, quiet life of the Brownstone could begin. I turned off the desk lamp, leaving the room in a comfortable, familiar darkness, and started the process of organizing the documents for the morning. The final act was yet to come, but for tonight, the truth had finally been spoken, and that, in Wolfe's world, was enough. Tend the quiet after the storm. The Brownstone had regained its equilibrium with a swiftness that was almost unsettling, as if the house itself were capable of shaking off the impurities we had dragged inside. By the following afternoon, the files had been delivered, the statements signed, and the news of the St. Clair downfall was already beginning to ripple through the city's legal circles. I was back at my desk, the typewriter clacking away with a rhythmic, reassuring sound that felt like a heartbeat. The case of Blackstone Manor was history, tucked away in the filing cabinet under a label that Wolfe would likely never have cause to consult again. Upstairs, the quiet was absolute. Wolfe was in the plant rooms, where he spent his afternoons in the company of his orchids, the only living things he considered capable of genuine loyalty and uncomplicated growth. Fritz was in the kitchen, the air already thick with the complex, savory aroma of a braised veal dish that was intended to serve as our celebratory, yet understated evening meal. I walked down the hall and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him work. There was something profoundly grounding about the way he handled the ingredients, a reminder that while the world outside was often a chaotic mess of betrayal and greed, there were still pockets of existence governed by order, care, and the pursuit of excellence. He looked up, gave me a brief knowing nod, and turned back to his pots. He knew the case was finished without me having to say a word. In this house, silence was the most efficient medium for communication. When dinner was finally served, the mood was one of quiet, intellectual satisfaction. Wolfe had descended from the plant rooms, his expression as unreadable and serene as a summer pond. We took our places at the table, the silver clinking softly against the china. He didn't speak during the first course, and I followed his lead, enjoying the perfection of the meal. It was only when we reached the final course, a delicate lemon-infused custard, that he finally broke the silence. He set his spoon down, leaned back, and looked at me with those sharp yellow eyes that seemed to see straight through to the core of any argument. He observed that the tragedy of the St. Clairs was not that they had done wrong, but that they had lacked the imagination to realize the inevitability of their own undoing. He spoke about the nature of human folly, his voice measured and devoid of any lingering bitterness. He reflected on how people often spent their entire lives building elaborate cages, not realizing that the bars they were constructing were made of their own lies. He noted that the collector in the Amazon had been a man of genuine curiosity, a person who had spent his life seeking the beauty of the natural world, while his killers were people who had spent their lives seeking to own, trade, and ultimately discard it. It was a classic moral reversal, one that Wolfe found deeply offensive on an intellectual level. He wasn't interested in the politics of their ruin, but he was profoundly satisfied that the intellectual debt had been settled. As he spoke, I thought about the man in the Amazon, a ghost whose story had finally been told. There was no grand sense of closure for him, no parade of honor, but there was the cold, clean satisfaction of justice. Wolfe picked up his glass of wine, took a slow, deliberate sip, and stared at the flickering candle in the center of the table. He said that the world was an untidy place, filled with people who lacked the discipline to act with clarity, and that it was our burden, or perhaps our privilege, to occasionally introduce a measure of precision into the madness. It wasn't a humble sentiment, but coming from him, it felt like an accurate assessment of his own life's work. Dinner ended as it always did, with a final lingering moment of quiet. I pushed my chair back, the movement echoing in the room, and felt the last vestiges of the Blackstone tension drain away. Wolfe rose, his massive form filling the doorway for a fleeting second, and remarked that tomorrow he intended to spend the entire day in the greenhouse. A new shipment of hybrids was arriving, and he was concerned about the humidity levels. He was already looking forward, his attention shifting back to the only things in his world that didn't demand his judgment. It was a perfect, self-contained conclusion. The mystery was a closed loop, the books were balanced, and the sanctity of the Brownstone remained as impenetrable as ever. I walked to the front door, checked the lock, and turned off the lights in the hallway, leaving the house to its own silence. I went back to the office, sat at my desk, and picked up a pen. I had the final report to finish, but for the moment I just stared at the blank page. I thought about the quips I could have made, the sharp remarks I could have leveled at the St. Clairs, but they didn't seem necessary anymore. The truth was its own punchline. I closed my notebook, leaned back, and listened to the city outside. It was a big, noisy, complicated place, but for tonight, everything was exactly where it belonged. The case was closed, dinner was eaten, and Brownstone was at peace. I let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of the last few days finally dissolve, and prepared for another, much quieter day.